If you ever see someone freezing in a storm, don't ask who they are. Just open the door. The wind howled across Maplewood Avenue like a restless animal, pushing waves of snow against the quiet storefronts and empty sidewalks of the small Colorado town. It was the kind of winter storm locals talked about for years, the kind that made even the streetlights flicker behind curtains of swirling white. Emily Carter pulled her coat tighter as she stepped out of the diner, the bell above the door chiming softly behind her. The warmth of Rosie's diner vanished almost instantly, replaced by a biting cold that made her breath turn to mist in the air. Her shift had ended 20 minutes late, which meant the last bus had already gone. Not that it mattered. In weather like this, nothing was moving anyway. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars buried under fresh powder and the distant hum of a snowplow somewhere down Main Street. Emily tucked her hands into her pockets and began the familiar half-mile walk to her apartment. The snow crunched beneath her boots, steady and rhythmic, the only sound in a town that had retreated indoors hours earlier. She had lived in Maplewood her whole life, long enough to know that storms like this turned everything quiet, long enough to know that sometimes quiet meant trouble. A gust of wind whipped past her, scattering flakes across her face, and she lowered her head as she crossed the intersection near the old bus stop. That's when she saw the shape. At first it looked like a pile of blankets against the bench, something small and still beneath the dim yellow streetlight. Emily slowed. Most people might have kept walking. The storm was getting worse by the minute, and common sense said the safest place was home. But something about the shape didn't sit right. She stepped closer, brushing snow from her eyelashes. It wasn't blankets. It was a woman, elderly, thin shoulders wrapped in a worn gray coat, her hands trembling as they clutched the edge of the bench. Snow had gathered in her silver hair and along the sleeves of her coat, as if she had been sitting there for a long time. Emily's heart tightened. "Ma'am," she called gently over the wind. The woman lifted her head slowly. Her eyes were tired but sharp, the kind of eyes that had seen many winters before this one. "Oh," the woman said softly, as if surprised anyone had stopped. "I suppose the buses stopped running." Emily glanced down the empty street. No headlights. No movement. Just the storm. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Hours ago." The woman nodded, her breath trembling in the cold air. For a moment neither of them spoke. Snow drifted across the pavement between them like powdered glass. Emily felt the weight of the moment settle in her chest. A stranger. A storm. A choice. She thought of her small apartment 2 blocks away. One couch. One kettle. One spare blanket folded at the end of her bed. It wasn't much, but it was warm. She stepped forward and offered her hand. "You're coming with me," Emily said simply. The woman looked at her for a long second, studying her face the way people do when they're deciding whether to trust someone they've never met before. Then a faint smile appeared. Slow, gentle, almost knowing. As the wind swept another wave of snow across the empty street, the woman took her hand and stood. Neither of them knew that somewhere, many miles away, a worried son was searching for her, and that by tomorrow morning, 3 black luxury cars would roll into Maplewood looking for the girl who had simply opened a door. The apartment was small, warm in the quiet way that came from a single humming heater and the soft glow of a kitchen light left on too long. Emily Carter closed the door behind them as another gust of wind rattled the windows, shaking loose flakes of snow that had gathered on the frame. The storm outside sounded distant now, like waves breaking far away. For a moment, the older woman simply stood there, her shoulders relaxing as the warmth reached her fingers. Snow slowly melted from the gray fabric of her coat, leaving small drops on the wooden floor. Emily hurried toward the kitchen and filled a kettle with water from the sink. The faucet groaned softly in the old pipes before steadying into a thin stream. "Please sit," Emily said, glancing back toward the narrow living room. The woman lowered herself onto the small couch beside the window, her movements careful but steady. Up close, Emily noticed the details she had missed outside. The coat was old but well made. The woman's posture carried a quiet dignity that did not quite match the image of someone lost at a bus stop during a snowstorm. The kettle began to whistle gently, and Emily turned off the burner before pouring steaming water into 2 mismatched mugs. She added a tea bag to each one and carried them over, the warmth rising between her hands. "Thank you," the woman said softly as she accepted the cup. Her voice was calm, the kind of voice people used when they had learned patience through many long years. Emily pulled the folded blanket from the back of the couch and draped it across the woman's shoulders. "You must have been out there for a while," she said. The woman looked toward the frost forming along the window and nodded slowly. "Long enough to realize that storms have a way of revealing who people truly are." Emily smiled faintly, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. "Well, tonight it revealed that Maplewood buses stop running way too early." The woman laughed quietly at that, the sound light but genuine. For a few minutes they drank their tea in comfortable silence while the wind continued to push snow against the building outside. The apartment was simple. A small wooden table, a narrow kitchen counter, a bookshelf filled with paperbacks Emily had collected from yard sales and thrift stores over the years. On the wall hung a single framed photograph of a younger Emily standing beside her mother on a bright summer afternoon. The woman noticed it immediately. "Your mother?" she asked gently. Emily nodded. "She lives across town now. I visit when I can." She did not explain more, but the pause in her voice carried its own story. The woman seemed to understand without asking further questions. She set her mug down and folded her hands in her lap, watching the steam drift toward the ceiling. "You helped a stranger tonight," she said after a moment. "Most people would have hurried past." Emily shrugged slightly. It did not feel like something special. It just felt like the right thing to do. The woman studied her with quiet interest, the same thoughtful expression she had worn beneath the streetlight earlier. Outside, the storm softened just enough for the distant rumble of a snowplow to pass somewhere down the street. Then the woman spoke again, her tone calm but strangely certain. "Tomorrow," she said slowly, "someone will come looking for you." Emily blinked in surprise before letting out a small laugh. "That sounds mysterious." The woman's eyes held a faint glimmer of amusement as she lifted her tea again. "Life has a way of surprising kind people," she said softly. And for reasons Emily could not quite explain, the simple words lingered in the quiet apartment long after the wind outside had begun to fade. Morning arrived quietly over Maplewood, the storm leaving behind a world wrapped in bright, untouched snow that reflected the pale winter sunlight through Emily Carter's apartment window. The heater hummed softly as the first light spread across the small living room and the narrow kitchen beyond it. Emily stirred awake on the couch. Wrapped in a blanket she did not remember pulling over herself. For a moment she simply listened. The storm was gone. The wind that had howled all night had settled into stillness, so complete it felt almost unfamiliar. Then she remembered the woman. Emily sat up quickly and looked toward the bedroom. The door was open. The bed inside was neatly made. Too neatly made. She stood and walked down the short hallway, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The room was empty. The blanket she had given the woman was folded carefully at the edge of the bed, as if someone had taken time to straighten it before leaving. Emily stepped back into the living room, glancing toward the small table beside the couch. That was when she saw the note. A single piece of paper rested beside the empty teacup from the night before. Emily picked it up slowly. The handwriting was elegant and steady, the kind that belonged to someone who had spent a lifetime writing letters instead of hurried text messages. "Thank you for your kindness during the storm. Not everyone stops when the world grows cold." Emily read the line twice before setting the note down again. It was simple. No name. No explanation. She exhaled softly and looked toward the window where sunlight now glowed across the fresh snow outside. The whole night suddenly felt like something out of a dream. A stranger in the storm. A quiet conversation over tea. A mysterious sentence about someone coming to look for her. Emily shook her head with a small smile. Life in Maplewood was rarely mysterious. She poured herself a cup of coffee and stood by the window for a moment watching a snowplow crawl slowly down the street, pushing thick white banks toward the sidewalk. People would start coming outside soon. The town would wake up again. After a quick shower and a simple breakfast of toast and eggs, Emily pulled on her coat and boots and stepped back into the winter morning. The air was crisp and bright, the sky clear blue above rows of snow-covered rooftops. Her breath rose in soft clouds as she walked toward Main Street. The diner sign was already glowing red when she arrived. Rosie stood behind the counter wiping a stack of mugs when Emily pushed the door open. The familiar bell chimed, and the warm smell of coffee and maple syrup filled the room. "Morning, Emily," Rosie called without looking up. "Quite a storm last night." Emily nodded as she tied on her apron. You could say that. The morning rush began slowly, just a few regular customers escaping their snow-covered driveways for hot coffee and pancakes. The quiet rhythm of the diner returned. Orders called out, plates clinking, coffee poured. For the next few hours, Emily barely thought about the stranger from the night before. It was just another small moment in a town full of them. Then, just after noon, the bell above the door rang again. But this time the room fell strangely quiet. Outside the large front window, 3 long black cars had just pulled up along the snowy curb. They were the kind of polished luxury vehicles people in Maplewood usually only saw in magazines. The diner door opened slowly. A tall man stepped inside, brushing a few snowflakes from the sleeve of his dark coat. His posture was calm but purposeful, the kind of quiet confidence that filled a room without effort. He looked around the diner once before asking a single question in a clear, steady voice. "Which one of you is Emily Carter?" The question seemed to settle over the diner like a sudden snowfall, soft but impossible to ignore. Every fork paused halfway to a plate. Every cup of coffee hovered just above the counter. Even Rosie stopped wiping the same mug she had been polishing for the last 30 seconds. The tall man stood calmly near the entrance, snow melting from the shoulders of his dark wool coat onto the tile floor. He did not appear impatient. He simply waited. Emily Carter felt her heartbeat shift slightly in her chest as she turned from the coffee machine. For a brief second, she wondered if she had heard him correctly. It was not every day that a stranger in a coat that probably cost more than a month of rent walked into Rosie's diner asking for her by name. She stepped forward slowly, wiping her hands on the corner of her apron. "I am Emily Carter," she said, her voice steady even though several curious eyes were now watching from nearby tables. The man's expression softened immediately, as if he had just confirmed something important. He took a step closer, careful not to track too much snow onto the floor. "Thank you," he said politely. His voice carried the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to speaking in boardrooms and quiet offices rather than small-town diners. Up close, Emily noticed details she had missed from across the room. The coat was tailored perfectly. His shoes were polished despite the snow outside. But there was something else too, something less visible. A kind of calm seriousness that made his presence feel deliberate rather than showy. Behind the window, the 3 black cars remained parked along the curb, their dark frames reflecting the bright winter sunlight off the snow. A few townspeople had already slowed their steps outside, curious about the unusual scene. The man extended his hand politely. "My name is Daniel Whitmore." Emily shook his hand, noticing the firm but respectful grip. The name meant nothing to her at first. Maplewood was not the sort of place where people followed business headlines or financial magazines. But the way Rosie quietly whispered the name under her breath behind the counter suggested it meant something to someone. Daniel Whitmore glanced briefly around the diner before returning his attention to Emily. "I apologize for arriving without warning," he said. "But I was hoping to speak with you about something that happened last night." Emily blinked once. A faint memory of snow, wind, and a quiet apartment flickered through her thoughts. "Last night," she repeated. Daniel nodded slowly. "My mother was traveling through this area during the storm," he explained. "Her driver was forced to turn around when the roads closed. She insisted on continuing on her own." He paused briefly before adding, "Apparently she encountered some difficulty along the way." The diner had grown so quiet that even the ticking of the wall clock above the kitchen door could be heard clearly. Emily suddenly remembered the silver-haired woman sitting beneath the bus stop light, the snow gathering in the folds of her coat. Daniel continued speaking, his tone calm but sincere. "She told me that a young woman brought her into a warm home, gave her tea, and treated her with kindness without asking a single question about who she was." Emily felt a small wave of realization rise slowly through her chest. "Your mother," she said quietly. Daniel nodded once. "Margaret Whitmore." The name carried weight, though Emily did not yet understand why. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small folded envelope. He held it carefully in his hand, but did not offer it yet. Instead, he looked directly at Emily with an expression that held both gratitude and curiosity. "Before I say anything else," he said gently, "my mother asked me to tell you something very specific." Emily waited, unsure why the room felt suddenly warmer than before. Daniel Whitmore smiled faintly as he spoke the words. "She said to find the girl who treated her like a human being when the world was cold." Emily Carter stood quietly beside the counter, the warmth of the diner suddenly feeling very different from the comfort it had carried just minutes earlier. Daniel Whitmore's words lingered in the air, gentle but heavy with meaning. Around them, the small diner slowly came back to life, though every customer continued pretending not to listen while clearly listening to every word. Rosie leaned against the coffee machine with folded arms, curiosity written plainly across her face. Emily looked at Daniel again, trying to connect the calm man standing in front of her with the silver-haired woman who had been sitting on her couch the night before. She seemed kind, Emily said softly. Daniel's expression warmed slightly. She is, he replied. But she is also someone who has spent most of her life surrounded by people who see her name before they see her as a person. Emily did not know how to answer that. She simply remembered the quiet conversation over tea, the way the woman had studied the photograph of her mother on the wall, and the strange sentence about someone coming to look for her the next day. Daniel carefully placed the folded envelope on the counter between them. He did not push it forward. He simply rested his hand beside it. My mother asked me to deliver this personally, he said. Emily looked down at the envelope, but did not touch it. The paper was thick and cream-colored, the kind used for formal letters rather than ordinary notes. You do not have to open it right now, Daniel added calmly. But she insisted I explain something first. Emily lifted her eyes again, uncertain but attentive. Daniel glanced briefly toward the snowy street outside before speaking again. Last night my mother was supposed to arrive at a charity event in Denver, he said. The driver insisted they turn back when the storm became too dangerous. But my mother has never liked being told what she cannot do. Emily could easily imagine that stubborn independence in the woman she had met. Daniel continued, his voice steady but thoughtful. She walked nearly half a mile through the storm before she reached that bus stop. Several of the diner customers quietly exchanged glances at that. Maplewood winters were not gentle to anyone walking alone in the dark. When she returned home early this morning, Daniel said, she told me the most unusual part of the entire experience was not the storm. Emily tilted her head slightly. It was you, Daniel said simply. Emily blinked. Me? Daniel nodded once. She told me she had spent the entire night with someone who treated her exactly the same way she would treat any tired traveler who needed help. No questions about money. No curiosity about her background. Just tea, warmth, and a place to sleep. Emily felt her cheeks warm slightly. I did not know who she was, she said quietly. Daniel smiled faintly. That is exactly why she was so impressed. He finally slid the envelope a few inches closer to her. My mother believes kindness should never disappear into the cold without being acknowledged. Emily hesitated for a moment before picking up the envelope. It was heavier than she expected. Not because of money, though that was what most people in the diner assumed. Something else rested inside. Something firm. She opened the flap slowly and slid the contents halfway out. A letter. Beneath it, a polished card with a simple name engraved in silver letters. Emily read the card silently. Her eyes widened just slightly before she looked back up at Daniel Whitmore. The room had gone quiet again, waiting for her reaction. Daniel's voice remained calm as he spoke one more sentence. My mother would like to meet you again, he said. But this time, without the snowstorm. Emily Carter held the letter carefully between her fingers, the polished card still resting on the counter beside it. The quiet inside the diner had become almost complete again, broken only by the faint hiss of the coffee machine and the distant rumble of a truck moving slowly down the snow-covered street. Emily unfolded the letter slowly, the thick paper making a soft sound as it opened. The handwriting was the same elegant script she had seen on the note that morning. She recognized it instantly. Dear Emily, thank you for opening your home to a stranger when the world outside was cold and unkind. Last night you offered warmth without knowing my name, and that kind of generosity is rarer than most people realize. I hope you will allow me the opportunity to return your kindness in person. Until then, please accept this small invitation as a token of my gratitude. Emily finished reading and lowered the letter slowly. For a moment she did not speak. Daniel Whitmore watched her reaction with quiet patience, his posture relaxed but attentive. Rosie leaned forward from behind the counter, pretending to rearrange sugar packets while clearly trying to see the card. Emily finally picked up the engraved card again. Beneath the name Margaret Whitmore was a simple line printed in clean silver letters. Personal guest invitation. Whitmore Foundation Winter Gala, Denver, Colorado. Emily blinked in disbelief. The event date was only 3 days away. She looked up at Daniel again. "This must be a mistake," she said softly. "I think your mother meant to invite someone else." Daniel shook his head gently. "My mother rarely makes mistakes." A few quiet chuckles drifted from the customers sitting nearby. Daniel continued, his voice calm and sincere. "She hosts the gala every year to raise money for medical research and community programs across the state. It is one of the few nights she insists on personally meeting the people who remind her why generosity matters." Emily glanced down at her apron and then back toward the windows where the 3 black cars waited outside like something from a different world. "I do not think I belong at an event like that," she admitted. Daniel's expression softened. "My mother would disagree." Emily folded the letter again, thinking about the tiny apartment, the stack of unpaid medical bills on her kitchen table, and the photograph of her mother smiling on the wall. She had helped the woman the night before because it felt natural, because leaving someone alone in a storm had never been an option. Now the situation felt strangely larger than she expected. Daniel seemed to sense her hesitation. "You are not being invited because of money or status," he said gently. "You are being invited because my mother believes the world needs more people who do what you did last night." Emily looked back at him, uncertain but thoughtful. For the first time, she realized the man standing in front of her was not here to impress anyone in the diner. He was here to deliver something that mattered to his mother. Daniel reached into his coat pocket again and placed a second card beside the first one. This one was simpler, just a phone number and his name. "If you decide to come," he said calmly, "call me. I will make sure everything is arranged." Emily nodded slowly, still absorbing the moment. Outside the window, the winter sun glimmered across the snow, bright and quiet. And for the first time since the storm began the night before, Emily Carter realized that one simple act of kindness had started a story she never could have imagined. The diner slowly returned to its usual rhythm after Daniel Whitmore stepped outside, the door closing behind him with the soft chime of the bell. Through the large front window, Emily Carter watched as he walked across the snow-covered sidewalk toward the line of black cars waiting along the curb. The winter sun reflected sharply off their polished surfaces, bright enough that several people passing by slowed to look twice. A moment later, the cars pulled away from the curb and disappeared down Main Street, leaving Maplewood quiet again. Inside the diner, the silence lasted only a few seconds before curiosity took over. Rosie leaned both hands on the counter and stared at Emily with wide eyes. "Emily Carter," she said slowly, as if testing the sound of the name again. "Do you realize who that man was?" Emily set the letter carefully back inside the envelope and shook her head. "Someone with very expensive shoes," she said quietly. Rosie let out a soft laugh, but her expression stayed serious. "Daniel Whitmore runs one of the largest investment groups in the state. His family funds hospitals, research centers, half the scholarship programs in Colorado. People read about them in magazines." Emily glanced down at the card again, the silver letters catching the light from the diner windows. Until yesterday, she had never heard the name. Now it sat in her hand, like something from a completely different world. The lunch rush began to fade as the afternoon sunlight stretched across the diner floor. A few regular customers paid their checks and stepped back out into the cold, still whispering quietly about the unexpected visitor. By the time the last table cleared, only Emily and Rosie remained behind the counter. Rosie poured 2 fresh cups of coffee and slid one toward Emily. "So," she said, leaning back against the counter, "are you going?" Emily wrapped her hands around the warm mug, thinking. The card rested beside the cup like a quiet invitation waiting for an answer. "I do not even have a dress for something like that," she admitted. Rosie waved a hand dismissively. "Details," she said. "The real question is whether you want to go." Emily stared out the window again. The snowbanks along the street glittered under the afternoon sun, and somewhere down the block a group of children laughed as they built a crooked snowman beside the library steps. Life in Maplewood had always been simple. Predictable shifts at the diner, quiet evenings at home, weekends visiting her mother across town. The idea of walking into a grand ballroom in Denver surrounded by people with last names like Whitmore felt almost unreal. "She was just a woman who needed help," Emily said softly. Rosie nodded. "Exactly." Emily looked down at the envelope again. She remembered the way Margaret Whitmore had studied the photograph of her mother on the wall. the way she had spoken about storms revealing who people truly were. Then Emily reached for the small card Daniel had left with his phone number and turned it over in her hand. The number was written clearly, waiting. Rosie watched her with a knowing smile. "You know," she said gently, "sometimes the biggest changes in life start with the smallest decisions." Emily took a slow breath, picked up the phone behind the counter, and looked once more at the number on the card before dialing. The line rang only once before Daniel Whitmore answered. His voice was calm and familiar. "Hello." Emily smiled faintly as she spoke. "This is Emily Carter," she said. "About the invitation." Outside the diner window, the winter sun continued shining across the quiet town, unaware that one simple phone call had just opened the door to a completely new chapter in her life. 3 days later, the road from Maplewood to Denver stretched across miles of white fields and quiet pine forests, the snow still resting along the shoulders of the highway like a memory of the storm that had started everything. Emily Carter sat in the back seat of the black sedan Daniel Whitmore had sent that morning, her hands folded gently in her lap as she watched the winter landscape pass by the window. The driver had introduced himself politely and spoken very little after that, leaving the car filled mostly with the soft hum of the engine and the distant rhythm of tires moving over cleared pavement. Emily still felt slightly unreal about the entire situation. Only 3 nights earlier, she had been pouring coffee at Rosie's diner and walking home through a snowstorm. Now she was traveling nearly 100 miles to attend an event she had never imagined herself stepping into. The dress she wore rested carefully beneath a warm coat across her shoulders, chosen the day before after Rosie insisted on driving her to the nearest department store 2 towns away. Rosie had treated the entire shopping trip like a mission of joyful determination, refusing to let Emily return home without something elegant enough for the evening. As the skyline of Denver slowly appeared in the distance, Emily felt a quiet mixture of excitement and uncertainty rise in her chest. Tall glass buildings reflected the pale winter sun, while traffic moved steadily through the wide city streets. The car eventually turned toward a large hotel near the center of downtown, where bright lights already glowed against the early evening sky. A line of vehicles stretched along the entrance, each one stopping briefly while guests stepped onto a long red carpet leading through the grand doors. Emily watched people arriving in tailored suits and elegant dresses, their laughter drifting through the cold air as photographers captured the moment. The driver stepped out and opened the door for her with professional courtesy. "We have arrived, Miss Carter," he said gently. Emily stepped onto the pavement, the cool evening air brushing against her face as she looked up at the tall entrance of the hotel. The building shimmered with warm golden light, and soft music floated out each time the doors opened to welcome another group of guests. For a brief moment, she considered the quiet diner back in Maplewood, the familiar clinking of dishes and the smell of fresh coffee. It felt like a different world now. But before doubt could settle in, a familiar voice spoke beside her. "You made it." Emily turned to see Daniel Whitmore standing near the entrance, dressed in a dark suit that matched the calm confidence she remembered from the diner. His expression carried the same gentle sincerity as before. "My mother will be very pleased you came," he said. Emily smiled softly. "I am still trying to understand how a simple cup of tea turned into this." Daniel glanced toward the glowing ballroom beyond the doors where music and conversation blended into a warm evening atmosphere. "Sometimes," he replied thoughtfully, "the smallest acts of kindness travel farther than we expect." Together they stepped inside the grand hall, where chandeliers cast soft light across polished floors and hundreds of guests moved through the room in quiet conversation. And somewhere among them, Margaret Whitmore was waiting to see the young woman who had opened her door on the coldest night of the winter. The ballroom shimmered with quiet elegance beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting softly across polished marble floors and tall windows that looked out over the snowy skyline of Denver. Conversations flowed through the room like gentle music, voices blending with the soft sound of a live piano playing near the far wall. Emily Carter stepped slowly beside Daniel Whitmore as they moved through the crowd, her eyes taking in the unfamiliar world around her. Men in tailored suits spoke quietly in small circles, while women in evening gowns laughed beside tables decorated with winter roses and silver candlelight. Everything felt graceful, calm, and carefully arranged, Yet Emily noticed something unexpected. Despite the luxury surrounding the room, the atmosphere was warm rather than distant. Daniel paused near the center of the hall and gestured gently toward a small gathering near the stage where a woman with silver hair stood speaking with several guests. Even from across the room, Emily recognized her immediately. Margaret Whitmore looked exactly as she had the night of the storm, though now she wore a deep blue evening dress and a delicate necklace that caught the light when she turned her head. The same thoughtful eyes, the same quiet dignity. Margaret looked up just then, as if sensing someone watching her. When she saw Emily standing beside Daniel, her face brightened instantly with genuine delight. She excused herself from the group and walked across the room with steady, graceful steps. Emily suddenly remembered the snow-covered bench, the warm tea, the small apartment filled with quiet conversation. It felt impossible that only 3 days had passed since that moment. Margaret Whitmore stopped in front of her and smiled warmly. "Emily Carter," she said softly, as if greeting an old friend. "I am very glad you came." Emily returned the smile, feeling the nervousness fade from her shoulders. "Thank you for inviting me," she replied. Margaret gently reached for Emily's hands, her voice carrying the same calm kindness from that snowy night. "I have attended many events in rooms like this," she said quietly, glancing around the ballroom. "But very few people inside them remember what it means to care for someone when there is nothing to gain." Emily shook her head gently. "I did not think about gaining anything," she said. "You needed help." Margaret nodded slowly. "Exactly." For a moment, the two women stood quietly while the music continued around them. Then Margaret turned slightly toward the stage where guests were beginning to gather. "Tonight," she said softly, "we celebrate generosity, donations, foundations, and all the ways people try to help the world." She paused and looked back at Emily with a knowing smile. But sometimes generosity does not come from wealth or influence. Emily felt the meaning behind those words settle gently in her heart. Margaret Whitmore then guided her toward the front of the room where the evening's program was about to begin. As they walked, Emily realized something simple but powerful. The storm that night had not changed who she was. She was still the same woman who poured coffee in a small-town diner and opened her door when someone needed warmth. Yet somehow that same kindness had traveled far beyond the quiet streets of Maplewood. And in that moment, standing beneath the glow of chandeliers beside the woman she had once helped during a snowstorm, Emily Carter understood a truth that few people ever notice. The world can change in many ways, but the smallest act of kindness often travels the farthest.